All right. I'm going to wait here and see if a few people will join us for today's webinar. So give us a few minutes and we'll get started. Probably start here at about 12:03, 12:04. So hang tight, everybody, and we will get started for today's webinar. Hey there, everybody just jumping in. We are going to start here in a couple minutes. Just give us some time and we'll get everybody into the webinar. So hang tight. Do one more minute here, okay? Hope everybody's having a great day as well. It's Friday Eve.
That's right. Big holiday weekend coming up.
Right, holiday weekend coming up.
Yeah.
It's exciting. All right, I think people are going to trickle in here as we start heading out into the webinar. So excited to see everybody jumping in. My name is Colin LeBeau. I am the president here at Fox Hire. We are an employer of record service that supports hundreds of staffing and recruiting agencies across the United States, and we specialize in healthcare staffing. Our group here today is going to talk about health and safety compliance in the healthcare staffing space. There's a lot of activity in this space right now. There is a lot of market opportunity as well as compliance and regulation happening. So I'm excited to introduce you to two of our rock stars here at Fox Hire, Jamie Henry and Jessica Arby. They have been instrumental in helping a number of our recruiting agencies grow their healthcare staffing business and ensure that they're completely compliant with all the laws, regulations, and necessary steps they need to take to protect their workers and their clients. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to them both. Feel free to introduce yourselves, team.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. So my name's Jamie Henry. I am the Director of Operations and Healthcare Services here at Fox Hire. I have been with the company for about 2 years or so, but most of my background has actually been in healthcare administration. I'm a registered nurse. I have a background in public health. So when it comes to safety and compliance, it's been part of my work life from day one. So this is a topic I'm super excited about, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here and offer some insight on how to improve practices in this area.
Great. And my name's Jessica Arby. I'm the HR manager. Like Jamie mentioned, a lot of her background is in compliance and mine is the same. So I've been in risk management and workers' comp and HR for about 15 years. And I've been with Fox Hire about 1.5 years now. transitioned from risk management and more into the HR manager role just recently. So I'm looking forward to filling everybody in on what we know and what we can do to help get you through the compliance issues.
So as Colin indicated, this is an extremely timely topic, right? So, healthcare safety has always been a challenge, but I think the pandemic has really brought it to the forefront and just made it that much more apparent to all of us. So, OSHA has had increasing oversight, and we're hearing more and more about the specifics of OSHA in the healthcare industry. I actually had the opportunity to participate in a group chat with healthcare professionals through the American Staffing Association last week. And this was a huge focus for that group. So this is where we spent a lot of our time discussing, current challenges in the industry. And, there are several things about healthcare staffing that are unique that create challenges that you really don't face in other areas. So, for example, our clients really own the worksite, right? So that worksite's a big part of safety, and there's a lot of compliance surrounding the worksite. And, it's a little nuanced when you're looking at it for staffing. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other challenge that many of us were discussing is that as our markets have grown, we no longer have close proximity to the majority of our clients. So not only do we not have control over those work sites, but we really don't have direct observation either. But that doesn't mean that we don't have the ability to take steps to both ensure the safety of our workers and reduce our risk by ensuring we're compliant in those spaces. And that's really what we're going to look at today. So we're going to start out by talking a little bit about OSHA and how OSHA defines compliance, both for the end client and for the employer, so the staffing agency or employer of record involved in that relationship. We're also going to look at the importance of really knowing the role and understanding how the knowledge of that role can impact safety. And then we're going to look at the credentialing practices, like the best practices for credentialing, to make sure that your candidate is the right fit for the role and the right candidate for the job. So I'll have Jess start us out by talking a little bit about OSHA.
Right, so I'll cover some info about OSHA and what the expectations are for, like Jamie said, host employers and the employer of record or the staffing agency, and just things that you want to be aware of in staffing. So what is OSHA? Everybody kind of has a hand in knowing what OSHA is really, but I think in staffing, it's a little different. It's kind of a lot different in some ways, just because there is that joint relationship. Just the basics. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They regulate and enforce workplace safety with a primary goal of protecting employees from hazards and from injuries. OSHA's standards provide guidance and direction for the employers on how to maintain a safe and healthy work environment. OSHA has been around since the 70s. So like I said, everybody knows what OSHA is. But in 2013, OSHA launched a temporary worker initiative. This was set to increase the focus on temporary workers by highlighting the employer's responsibilities to ensure that the workers are protected from workplace hazards. So in temporary staffing per OSHA, like I said, there are joint responsibilities between the host employer and also the staffing agency. And we'll go over, what some of those primary responsibilities are in the next few slides. But for additional information, if you're not already familiar with it, there is that OSHA Temporary Worker Initiative, and you can find that by going to osha.gov/temporary workers, and it provides a lot of details and bulletins and flyers and things like that that can help you in your business. So some of the responsibilities of the host employer. The host employers must provide a safe work environment free of known dangers for the workers. They must provide specific training that is tailored to the work site, also tailored to the workplace equipment and any specific industry hazards or any kind of hazards that are related to tasks within their jobs or their roles. And then also they're required to provide the personal protective equipment that's required for the job or specific tasks within their jobs. It's also important for the host employer to be aware that temporary employees have the same rights under OSHA as a permanent or direct hire employee at the work site. So they have the right to a safe workplace. They have the right to receive the training in clear language that they understand. They have the right to receive safety equipment, all that PPE that needs to be provided. They have the right to speak up about workplace safety and also to report any work-related injury or accident without any kind of punishment. And those are laid out rules by OSHA. So we want to make sure that we're following that. The staffing agency or the employer of record also has responsibilities in this. We don't have any real control over the work site, but we do have some responsibility for general safety training and health training, but just very basic information. Did you guys lose me? I'm sorry. It looks like it lost connection. Okay, okay, good. So like I said, for the staffing agency, we would have that requirement to provide general health and safety training. And according to OSHA, the other part that is important for the staffing agency to remember is that we have the duty to inquire and verify that the host employer has provided the proper training and also that they're fulfilling their responsibility for a safe workplace. So that's an important part of the client vetting process for Foxhire. In the next slide here, we're going to talk about the way that we evaluate our clients. So at least as far as like the safety part of it. So in terms of workplace safety, we evaluate clients based on a handful of things. One of the primary things that we look at is the OSHA establishment search. Jamie will go over that in a little more detail here in a few minutes, but basically we use that to determine what kind of OSHA investigations have been in the past, any kind of citation history that might exist with that potential client. Another part would be our client safety profile. We do that through our client approval process, and that information is a series of questions and like a survey that we send to our client. It asks specific safety questions and what their policies and procedures look like, and it opens that door for dialogue. If there are any questions or concerns, that we can kind of get to the bottom of it and really get an understanding of what their workplace is like. And then also part of that would be our safety partnership agreement. So we use that in conjunction with our safety profile to determine or to provide information really to the end client on what the host employer's responsibilities are, and then also what the role of the employer of record is in relation to the safety of that temporary employee. So that might include like, what are the accident reporting procedures? If there is a work accident, what are the return to work plans that we have in place for that worker? Who's responsible for the OSHA 300 log and record keeping and things like that. In this next slide, we just kind of provide a list for the different types of safety training and orientation that OSHA requires in healthcare work environment. So typically you'll have orientation that includes things like employee and employer rights and responsibilities, safety awareness in the workplace, which includes like site or industry or job specific hazards, hazard communication, it's also known as HAZCOM. That includes awareness of different chemicals at the workplace, the safety data sheets and how to read them, proper labeling and storage and cleanup procedures, things like that. Emergency action plans is another big area. It's very specific to the work site. So things like evacuation procedures, if there's a fire or shelter in place, if there's weather emergency or lockdown procedures. There's safety, fire safety, bloodborne pathogens, personal protective equipment, ladder safety, slips, trips, and falls, safe lifting practices. That's another big one in healthcare. That's probably one of the most common workplace injuries in healthcare would be related to lifting. Ergonomics, heat-related illness awareness, and also respiratory protection. That's probably one of the biggest ones that's kind of targeted right now related to COVID-19. It's important to have in your respiratory protection plan things like medical evaluation, respiratory fit testing, those kind of important areas. And Jamie will talk a little bit more detailed about that here in a few minutes as well.
Jess, this slide is really interesting to me. So if we can just keep this one up for a second.
Mhm.
I kind of want to point out to everybody joining us, this one is one that has been a particular challenge for us as of recent. We've had increasing requests from our clients for the OSHA training to be completed by the employer of record. So they want us to present our candidates, ready for employment with that OSHA training complete. And they're asking us for, a certificate of completion for an OSHA course. But just looking at this slide, it makes it abundantly clear why a canned OSHA course provided online would not be sufficient to ensure safety of the worker in the workplace, right? And not only, it doesn't just ensure their safety or not ensure their safety, but it clearly would indicate that the client's not been compliant in that case, because as you indicated, so many of those items listed are very specific to each client's unique environment and therefore would not be covered under a canned OSHA product that we would purchase. So just an important point to make. I know as staffing agencies and employers of record, we're always looking to provide, that premier level of service. We want to do everything we can to satisfy a client's requirements. But this is just a great example of where, it's important for us to know what really is the client's requirement and to understand that action on our part does not in fact satisfy that requirement then, right? So just something to kind of keep in mind. But
and Jess, I have a question. So let's assume some of the recruiters here may not be familiar with some of this training and or think or rely on clients to do this training. Is there anything here that we can delineate is like only the client's end client's facility responsibility? And then also, are there things here that recruiters could go ahead and take care of to ensure that that box is checked for their people?
I'd say yes and no. So like you said, there are some things that, and Jamie said too, there are some things that are very specific. So things like the emergency action plan, hazard communication, that's kind of like one of those twofold ones where you can provide some of the basics, but really, it's got to be drilled down to what specifically is at the work site and how do we respond to, to those chemicals and things like that. Where's that SDS book located that provides all the details and everything? We don't have that information, right? So, but yeah, some of the things that are definitely going to be required by the end client would be that hazard communication, emergency action plans, personal protective equipment, because you have to provide training on how to use that specific PPE that's been provided. So they're providing the PPE, they're also providing the training on how to utilize and when to utilize that PPE. Safe lifting practices, it depends on what kind of equipment they have available to the workers at that site. So the lifting practices might be different from one location to another. Ergonomics, again, it's specific to the work site and the jobs that are being done. Heat-related illness awareness is another one where it's specific to the location. You might have one facility where they're working without air conditioning versus another facility that does have, depending on what type of situation it is. Like we've had some that were working outdoors in, that type of environment. And then also the respiratory protection is another big one that is very specific to the site and the PPE that's provided by the work site. Some of the ones that are just the general information would be like the employee and employer rights, safety awareness, just the basics sometimes you can provide there. Ladder safety, slips, trips, and falls. A lot of times those are very basic. Bloodborne pathogens, again, is another one that's pretty standard in most situations. And I'd say another one I had in mind, the hazard communication. You can provide some of the information on that. So I'd say it's probably like half and half in this list. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So the next area that we want to focus on is, knowing the role that you're hiring for. There's a lot of information that you need to understand about the position that you're recruiting a placement for before you really get into that recruitment process. And so we always start by making sure that we've been provided with an accurate job description. So it really needs to be complete and thorough. A lot of times the first blush attempt at this, we get 1 to 2 sentences, and Obviously for almost any role in healthcare, that's not going to begin to cover what we need to know to ensure that we are putting the right placement in that role. We always kind of help to educate our recruiters on the importance of that job description and that it really should come directly from the client. So there's a saying in healthcare that a nurse is not a nurse is not a nurse. And that's because there are so many variations in terms of, the level of licensing that you can have, the scope of practice that that license allows, which can vary by state as well. So that's important to know. And then there's the additional layers that come with that, right? So there's different types of professional certifications and levels of education and some other things that you would need to know that are specific to that role before you could determine exactly what qualifications you need in a candidate to ensure the appropriate fit. The other piece of that that's really important too is that job description is really going to be what helps you to determine the appropriate workers' compensation code. So, that ties back obviously to that, insurance piece that's being paid for the worker in that environment. You want to make sure that that code really does line up with both the role and the environment in which the individual will be working. The other thing that job description is going to allow you to do is to determine whether or not that individual could be placed as a 1099 versus a W-2. So I'm not sure if everybody who's joined us today has had this experience, but one of the things that FoxHire has had over the past couple of years is an increase in demand for 1099 placements. And we're hearing this both from our clients and from our contractors, which is interesting, right? So I think some of it kind of comes from some misinformation surrounding the idea of a 1099. And so we will get requests where people think that this is the manner in which they want to be employed. The reality is that the majority of healthcare positions are not going to qualify to be placed as a 1099 if you walk yourself through that questionnaire. And there's a couple of primary reasons for that. So when you consider a 1099, they're truly meant to be an independent contractor, right? And it's that word independent that really creates a challenge for us with this. And that's because the majority of healthcare professionals work in an environment that is tightly controlled by policy and procedure, which means that your employee is not determining how they do their work. It's being scripted for them. There's also a heavy emphasis on the client-specific training, which again is directing them in how the work is to be done. They often have to work on the client's premises during set hours, meaning they don't determine the when, they don't determine the where. They have to report their work. Most healthcare professionals are doing charting with every shift. So that charting is really a form of reporting. And then most importantly, the majority of healthcare professionals are going to be working under orders, right? So somebody at a higher license level is going to be writing the orders that allow those professionals to work within their scope of practice. So that right there tends to be the primary most reason why healthcare workers cannot be labeled a 1099. So something to really be aware of. There are some exceptions. Typically, those are going to be your higher license level professionals. So your nurse practitioners, your sometimes physician's assistants, although that's a little tricky because they work underneath a physician. So it depends on how that's structured. But then your physicians and some of those roles will be eligible for that 1099 placement type. But again, that's where that job description can really help you to suss some of that out.
Jamie, can we talk about some of the implications going back to 1099 W-2? Like, let's say I'm a recruiter and I currently have a certain number of contract workers out on assignment now that are 1099s. Like, what are some of the risks I need to be aware that I'm taking if they were to be considered W-2 through some type of audit situation? Like, what are some of the things I might incur, either costs or penalties?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Colin. So I think the biggest thing to be aware of is you only have to have one placement come under question and for the IRS to find a flaw in that placement being listed as a 1099 instead of a W-2. And that opens the door for them to come in and look at all of your current 1099 placements and even go back in history to kind of track how that 1099 placement's been happening. And, I think one of the biggest issues with 1099s versus the W-2 is the way the taxes are handled. And so you could end up with some pretty stiff penalties and back pay, et cetera, if you have misclassified a worker as a 1099 when they should have been a W-2. So there's an important distinction in that respect. Now, for your Your healthcare professionals, they also need to be careful. They wouldn't want to be, misclassified as a 1099 because it could potentially put them in a situation where they're not appropriately operating under the scope of their license. So most of those professionals, until you hit the level of that nurse practitioner, have to be functioning under a higher license level that can provide those orders. And that without that, they're technically not operating within the scope of their license, and therefore could, have significant penalties to include loss of the license.
Right. Yeah. And I saw quite a few different situations over the last 12 months that came out in the news with fines, for just the misclassification, the back taxes. So there's the employer related taxes that you would have ultimately paid if you had classified them as a W-2. Things like FUTA, SUTA, Social Security, things of that nature. And then lastly is the overtime. So a lot of times you're not getting the overtime pay if you're a 1099. And so then you got a real big stiff penalty there, not necessarily a penalty, but they were owed overtime that they weren't otherwise paid. And so, it's very easy to get into the 7 figures in that case. So just want to be aware of some risks you're taking if you are operating in that manner, so that you can take the right actions to protect yourself and your workers.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. You're absolutely right. So once you've had a chance to fully look at what's required for the role, and you start the process of screening for your candidates, it's really important to appropriately screen and credential those placements. I know we're all familiar with the term credentialing, right? And probably almost to the point of exhaustion. And primary source verification has been around forever. But if you look closely at what the Joint Commission recommends as far as primary source verification, they want both a verification and what's known as a reconciliation. So verification is the process by which you determine a license, given the number of that license and the name, are valid and that there are no sanctions against that license that would restrict them to practice. What it doesn't tell you is who that license actually belongs to. So I like to use myself as an example. My maiden name is Smith. So if you put Jamie Smith into the Ohio Board of Nursing, which is where I was originally licensed, the last time I checked, there are 8 Jamie Smiths with active Ohio licenses. There's no way to tell through just doing a general primary search which one of those licenses is mine, or if any of those licenses are mine. So with the increased demand for temporary staffing in healthcare, it goes without saying, we've seen an increase in license fraud. So the way you can protect yourself against fraud is the reconciliation piece. And so the best practice for that is to be able to reconcile that license against like date of birth and social security number. Most licensing bodies have not gotten that sophisticated yet. Nursing has, they've been around the longest. It's one of the easiest professions to do it with. Using nurses in EOR SYS, you can set up an agency account that will then allow you to run license numbers provided to you by your candidates against the social and date of birth that they provide you. And that will verify that that license does in fact belong to them and they are good to practice under that license. We have caught 2 in the past year submitted to us that did not own their licenses. So we ran 2 through the system that once verified didn't match the social and date of birth. And sure enough, when we tried to reach out to the contractor to verify, they ghosted us. So pretty strong indicator that we probably had some license fraud going on there. So that's a great practice. For those license types that don't yet have the ability, you can collect a copy of the license. And bear in mind that this should not be a mirror image of that same primary source verification that you could do. That's a public search. That's actually what's feeding into license fraud, because that's how people are obtaining license numbers for people who have names that match theirs and misrepresenting themselves. This should be a copy of a document provided by the licensing board that either bears a signature. Ideally, it should have a seal or a QR code, something that would be much harder to fraudulently create. So just an FYI, some boards, like the North Carolina State Board of Nursing is a great example, have gone to not issuing paper licenses. And so then what you can do is reach out through that board and again, provide that information like we just discussed that would identify that individual, and they'll reconcile that license for you. There's also additional searches that we recommend. You're probably familiar with some of these. So like the System for Award Management, the Office of Inspector General, the Office for Foreign Asset Control. Asset control. That's one I always have to look up. Sorry. The FDA debarment checks have become really popular. Again, we're doing a lot of those. And so those are all ways that you can kind of look into, your employee's background in that healthcare space. And then we, of course, also recommend the general searches, right? So background check, ideally it should be at least up to 7 years, if not more. Past employment verification is also fantastic. We do recommend doing that when possible. Education verification, it's a fit for some roles in healthcare, not necessarily others. It can be redundant, right? A lot of licenses require the education to be verified upon licensure, but you have some roles where you can have education requirements that exceed what was required for licensing. So, if you have a manager in respiratory therapy or nursing, they may be required to have a bachelor's or master's degree that you wouldn't be able to verify just by verifying their license. So in that case, we would recommend doing that additional educational verification just to ensure that they are meeting the standard your client has. And then, of course, we do recommend drug screening as well. And for the most part, our clients are still requesting that standard 10-panel urine drug screen, although we have seen anywhere from, like custom 12 to 14 panel as well. So we always verify exactly what our client's looking for in a drug screen before that drug screen is conducted. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the work environment, and Jessica gave some specific examples of things we can do. We talked about the role, we talked about the contractor, and listed out some things there too. So this is just an opportunity to summarize and talk a little more in depth if needed about some of those areas. So like Jessica said, we have pretty solid practices around how we review the work environment. We issue that client safety profile before our client's ever approved to work with FoxHire. So before that first submission ever comes in for them, we've done that deep dive, and we've really looked at where OSHA says that client is responsible for providing different types of training. We also ask specific questions about the work environment, the OSHA 300 log, how accidents and injuries are reported. We get really deep into respiratory fit testing, which I'll get to that in just a second. The other thing we do is issue that safety partnership agreement, which then goes on file. And as Jess indicated, that is a very specific and detailed partnership agreement, kind of written in the format of a letter, but it includes basically all of the expectations that OSHA has of that client site for maintaining compliance and safety for that worker and that environment, and their requirements to communicate with us in our shared partnership for the safety of that employee. And then there's the OSHA establishment search, which we touched on briefly. If you haven't familiarized yourself with this service yet, I would do that today. I would bookmark this website and I would use it at your initial conversation with any clients that you're talking to. This search is fantastic. It's free, it's simple. We do it for every client that we start communication with. We just throw them into the search engine. It goes back for 5 years. So right now it'll take you back to 2017. It's going to show you any past citations, and it's going to give you a good feel for what you need to watch out for with that client. The majority of our searches do come back clean, which is really exciting and reassuring news. We always save a record of that search. So we'll just take a screenshot, keep it on file, and have that for our information just to show that we did do that little extra step. Now, occasionally, we do find citations, and those are also important to be aware of. Prior to 2020, a lot of the citations in the workplace were around things like, their hazard control, slip, strips, and falls, that kind of thing. This is not going to shock anybody. But starting with 2020, the vast majority of the citations are now around respiratory control. So the pandemic really heightened the focus in this area, and specifically with 3 particular parts of the respiratory protection program. So OSHA has an overarching requirement of a respiratory protection program, but that defines multiple components. If you're not familiar with that yet, I'd Google that as well. Save a record of what those requirements are and make sure that you can reference them in conversations with your clients. But the 3 areas that the majority of our clients are being fined for, the majority of healthcare entities, not just our clients, are being fined for, are not having a developed and written respiratory protection program, not having medical evaluation prior to fit testing. So I think where there's a bit of a knowledge gap there is that wearing a respirator, which is what an N95 mask is, calling it an N95 is kind of like calling, any tissue a Kleenex kind of thing, right? It's just a specific type. So the respirator mask requires a fit test because it does increase your work of breathing. So we have to make sure people are safe to wear them even before we fit test them. And OSHA is very specific about this. So the order of events is medical evaluation, fit test, then you may wear that mask for the first time while you're providing care. That has probably been the two biggest areas, have been failing to do the medical evaluation and failing to do the fit test before that healthcare provider puts that mask on for the first time. So reason for that being, obviously, those masks really increase safety. OSHA now has a very low tolerance for failure to protect your workers, and they're heavily applying fines to correct for this practice. So we have seen, you'll see fines in the media anywhere from 10 all the way up to that 275. I think we've even seen a few that were higher than that. But we actually have worked directly with recruiters who have had fines in that $10,000 range for making a placement without vetting that client first. Most of these complaints that are leading to these fines are coming from whistleblowers. These are our very savvy contractors who have lived in a world of overexposure to the media for the past few years, heavily focused on the employer's responsibility to protect them. So they are knowledgeable about what is required. They're quick to identify the gaps, and they know how to report it. So this is an area where I would caution you to be very, very careful and make sure you're paying close attention to your client's practices. We actually have a list of specific questions just on respiratory protection, and we specifically target those 3 bullet points in that list of questions. There are some others too, but those 3 are heavy hitters for us. We will not approve a client that says no to any one of those 3 things without clarifying and getting additional information first.
Jamie, got a question here. So let's say I'm a recruiter and I don't use Foxhire as an example. And
Okay.
I have a client that I really want to work with, but they don't do these fit testing practices. Could I take that burden on myself? And if so, are there any tools I could use to enable my workers to be protected, even if the work site doesn't necessarily follow those same guidelines?
Yeah, Colin, we get that question all the time. So that's fantastic. The answer to that should be, it's a soft no. You shouldn't work with that person or with that client. And here's why. That fit testing is a part of the respiratory protection program that they're required to have by OSHA. Now, they don't have to do the fit testing on site. They can use an outside service provider. We have clients that use, like Concentra is a great example. They use Concentra to do all their fit testing. So they issue their employee the mask. The employee goes to Concentra. Concentra does the medical evaluation first, the fit test second. We typically receive copies of those as the employer of record, and employers who use those services will usually be the ones to receive copies on their end. And that meets that part of the requirement. The problem is there's a lot more to that. So if you do have a client you want to work with that maybe doesn't do fit testing on site, you can loop them into a service that does the fit testing, but you need to make sure that they also provide the appropriate education for donning and doffing and all of the other requirements for using a respirator, and that they are doing follow-up testing at least annually. So testing is required to be done anytime you have certain changes in your medical condition, or at least annually at a minimum. So those would be things you'd want to look into. And the other piece of this that can be confusing, but is extremely important, we actually just dealt with one this morning, is that if you're using an external source for fit testing, whether it's sending somebody to an external source or taking a previously completed fit test from either another staffing agency, another employer, et cetera, you have to make sure that the mask that they were tested in is the same or comparable to the mask that the worksite will be using. So the fit test is not just for the face, it's for how the face works with that particular mask. So it's really, really important to make sure that that's the case. So it should always be a NIOSH approved mask, and it needs to be, if it's not the same mask, it needs to be what they call like a sister size mask for that make and model. So yeah, good question. We get that one a lot. Yeah, absolutely. And then last but not least, like we said, know your contractor. So those are all the checks that we talked about, knowing the requirements of the role ahead of time. So getting that job description, having it on file, and then making sure that you're doing all of the credentialing and compliance verification and risk mitigation and keeping records of all of those steps as well. So that's a lot of information. Do we have any questions? Is there anything anybody would like to review in more depth?
Yeah, and feel free to post the questions in the Q&A box. You can find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen under Q&A. We're going to wait a few minutes for you guys to type out some questions. If you have any, feel free, and we will answer those as they come in. So hang tight here for a second, and we'll see some questions come in, hopefully. But if not,
well, actually, hey, Colin, before we get to that, I apologize. I kind of skipped over. I was wondering, Jess, can you spend a quick minute and just talk about how our practices have impacted our business? I do realize we kind of really didn't get into, how that mitigation has helped us, aside from making sure we keep a good reputation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, by implementing these kind of procedures that we have in place, evaluating our clients before we start working with them and drilling it down to, is this someone that we can work with and feel like we're putting our workers in a safe environment? We find that it really does help us manage risk, and we find savings in that. So we, at Foxhire, we're with a group rated healthcare captive for our workers' comp insurance. And I think a big part of the result that we see is because of the things that we're doing. And what we're finding is that, in that group rating that we're in, we're at the top of the tier. So that means we're also going to receive top tier savings on our policy every year. So, I think it really helps. And I think it's, proven for us. So.
Yeah, great point. How many people are in that captive with us, Jessica?
I want to say it's like 38 different employers, and we're number one.
Cool. Yeah. So any questions, guys, in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer those, type those out, and we will address those as they come in, give you guys maybe 1 or 2 minutes to punch those in and hit enter over to us. Otherwise, we'll close it out for today. So we'll hang here for a second. Yeah, I don't see any questions coming in. So really, really appreciate everybody that joined today's call. Hopefully you found that helpful. If you're sitting there thinking, wow, that's a lot of stuff to do, I don't know that I am doing that, or I can do that, or I don't want to, feel free to reach out to us. We can definitely talk to you about supporting you in that regard. Our employer of record service and platform helps place hundreds and thousands of healthcare workers every year in a number of different disciplines, including nursing, respiratory therapy, radiology, medical technologists, et cetera. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any interest. Otherwise, have a great day and holiday weekend. And thanks from everybody here at Foxhire. Appreciate it. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks.